up, but they know, buried alive by the lies in they soul. They stride of a blind man's stroll, but for whom does the next bell toll? I'm too many years in the zone, too many years to have built what I own. And many dumb fools try to take what I've grown, but these roots go deep and you can't blood a stone. So if you wanna push, I'ma shove. If you wanna spar, we can do it, no gloves. And if you're gonna run at me, you better do it hard, cause I fear no fall, no brawl, no scars. I'm shy of a bomb, I'm one shade short of alarm. I'm too past wrath that I'm calm. Got two last laughs in my palms. I'm 3 degrees west of a hurricane. 4-wheel drive with a ball and chain. My 5'7" is irrelevant. I'm 6'6" if you threaten my development. Now see, a wise man learns from your mistakes and lets the blunders of his brother serve to fill his plate. So best be on your way before the tidal wave breaks, cause you don't wanna come to meet the reaper that awaits. You don't wanna say no more than a mom you can't afford. And you don't wanna let this turn in the lines of mine and yours. And you don't wanna press your luck, but to back up and withdraw. Cause trust me when I tell you, you don't want that tooth and claw. And you don't wanna see inside the mind of savage kind. And you don't want that recognition of, oh, there goes that guy. But if you do decide that you were gonna play that hand and try, just think before you act, because your actions go around. A man with a grudge in a case, a man with intent on his face. And if a man walks in a place, let it be known I won't hesitate. This a long time coming like a comet pass. Got them all fired up from the rocket blast. And if I fall on my sword, turn my bone to ash. Let it clog up the sand in that hourglass. We in the title fight, blow for a blow. And you can reap the benefit of what I have to sow. Cause I'm about that worth of which you don't appear to know. So you can take the scene while I take over the show.
It's a long way down when your head is in the clouds. And all around the sirens play. Don't get in my way. Don't tell me I should bow, cause I'm no clown. This is not a game. Don't get in my way.
You don't wanna say no more than a mom you can't afford. And you don't wanna let this turn in the lines of mine and yours. And you don't wanna press your luck, but to back up and withdraw. Cause trust me when I tell you, you don't want that tooth and claw. And you don't wanna see inside the mind of a savage kind. And you don't want that recognition of, oh, there goes that guy. But if you do decide that you were gonna play that hand and try, just think before you act, because your actions don't rewind. Poisoned by the snakes in the grass, hoaxed by the rats out the maze. They should've never poked the lion as he passed, cause now it's 2 hawks in a cage. This a tale of a cautionary kind. This a story of that Icarus design. This the message from the hanged man's twine. This when Mother Nature rips apart the fault lines. And this the type of thing that make a grown man cry. When feeble of the spine crumble underneath the grind. When blessings of the meek lead to lessons of the blind. When heaven shows its teeth and the planets are aligned. So amusing is the feeling as they race off. Got amusing from the pressure as I chase off. Should've thought it through before we turn the face off. Now this fool sounding like he gonna turn his bass off. This an ace card, cut the game short. You don't wanna have an escalation of the main sword. And you don't wanna feel the flame that burns pride. Now you know the reason why those sleeping dogs lie.
Long way down when your head is in the clouds. And all around the sirens play. Don't get in my way. Don't tell me I should bow, cause I'm no clown. This is not a game. Don't get in my way.
You don't wanna say no more than a mom you can't afford. And you don't wanna let this turn in the lines of mine and yours. And you don't wanna press your luck, but back up and withdraw. Cause trust me when I tell you, you don't want that tooth and claw. And you don't wanna see inside the mind of a savage kind. And you don't want that recognition of, oh, there goes that guy. But if you do decide that you were gonna play that hand and try, just think before you act, because your actions go around.
Hybrid work is better with...
No idea how much I appreciate what you have just done for this company, but I never want
One legend was given the gift of immortality. So what does Voodoo
to see anything like that again. And to ask Foley himself, he says his only regret is that it cost him upwards of $15,000 in dental work, and it was all in the name of entertainment. The reason I'm talking so much about pro wrestling and the infamous Hell in a Cell match is that there is a stigma that follows pro wrestlers that simply because the outcomes are predetermined, that the wrestlers themselves are somehow fakes.
That was WWE, guys. That's right, pussies. I told you all.
But if it's a choice between being knocked out by Yoel Romero and fending off his unwanted sexual advances while still half concussed,
Why are we still here? Just to suffer?
or taking part in that Hell in a Cell match, I'm gonna DM Yoel right now and start working on my power bottom game. Pro wrestling at the highest level exacts a toll on the human body equal to or worse than MMA.
But that's, I tell people all the time there, James, that I've been hurt far worse in my professional wrestling career than I have been in all my cage fights.
Francis Ngannou may hit with the power of a mid-sized Ford Escort, but if you're being thrown off the top of a 16-foot high cage, you better hope you quick-saved beforehand. And while CM Punk may not have had any iconic moments on the level of the infamous Hell in a Cell match, by the time he joined the UFC in 2014, Punk had sacrificed his body for the love of the game as hard as any MMA fighter. Punk came up in the indie wrestling circuit, basically the Wild West, but with more people getting powerbombed through tables. He was well known for having put himself through hellish 90-minute long matches. After one such match in 2003, Punk wrote about it online immediately post-match and described relishing the feeling of having taken part in a 90-minute match despite having his ear half torn off his head, not being able to hear, and both his elbows being completely shot. Again, the fights may be predetermined, but the damage received and the toughness required to take part is absolutely real. If any athlete outside of the sphere of actual combat sports has a chance at crossing over into the brutal world of MMA, it's a veteran pro wrestler. Having said all that, CM Punk is not the first pro wrestler to cross over to MMA, but he was definitely the least qualified. Phil Brooks, aka CM Punk, started his wrestling career during the boom years of the Attitude Era, but wouldn't join the WWE until 2005, long after that era had been thrown off the top of a steel cage never to recover. And when I say wrestling career, I don't mean collegiate wrestling, you know, the kind that's actually beneficial for an MMA fighter. I'm strictly talking about the powerbomb off the top of a ladder kind of wrestling. Far from the spotlights and crotch chops of the WWE, Punk was honing his craft by wrestling in backyards before eventually working his way onto the indie circuit, which is essentially still backyard wrestling, but indoors. As the son of an alcoholic father, Punk made being straight edge his main selling point for his wrestling persona. Straight edge, if you're not familiar, is a subgenre of the hardcore punk scene that espouses the virtues of not drinking, smoking, or doing drugs, which as far as wrestling gimmicks go, is right up there with the Mantor in terms of coolness. Straight edge adherents have a reputation for being preachier than a Yoel Romero victory speech.
Go for Jesus! Not forget Jesus, people!
And Punk leaned into it hard as part of his gimmick, routinely telling the crowd how being straight edge meant he was better than them. It's a wonder that Punk ever became as big as he did. CM Punk's popularity in the WWE seems to be a difficult thing even for pro wrestling fans to explain. His straight edge gimmick wasn't really a gimmick, it was just him being straight edge. and his popularity peaked in the early 2010s, the era when party rock was in the house and everyone wanted to get shit-faced and forget the fact that the 2008 market crash was being paid for out of your pocket and not the bank's.
This could be the most serious recession in decades. And that means life, as most Americans know it, is about to change, in some cases dramatically.
So Punk telling people not to drink and do drugs in those days practically constituted hate speech. He didn't have any costumes or wacky shit. He never adopted any other kind of personas or attitudes. He was always just himself. And in an industry where it seems to be a requirement to have a physique best described as a bipedal refrigerator that stores all its meat on the outside, throughout his career, Punk was derided for being small and not particularly muscular. But for a pro wrestler, being called small just means you're not a homunculus of ham hocks and spare dumbbells.
Whoa! Very fantastic body!
And maybe it was Punk's actually attainable physique combined with his razor-sharp microphone skills that helped get him over with fans. Punk's skills on the mic were truly outstanding, and the highlight of his career would be what came to be known as the Pipe Bomb promo. With his WWE contract expiring, Punk had been vocal about wanting to leave the company. At an episode of Raw, he was given an open mic and allowed go off script and air his grievances with the company. Punk went off script harder than a drunk Jared Leto. He complained about his lack of promotion by the WWE.
I'm not on your lovely little collector cups. I'm not on the cover of the program. I'm barely promoted. I don't get to be in movies. I'm certainly not on any crappy show on the USA Network.
And absolutely lacerated WWE owner Vince McMahon in a way that would cause MMA fans to be collectively sent to the shadow realm if a fighter ever roasted Dana in the same way post-fight.
And I'd like to think that maybe this company will be better after Vince McMahon's dead, but the fact is, it's gonna get taken over by his idiotic daughter and his doofus son-in-law and the rest of his stupid family.
After the Pipe Bomb promo, Punk's popularity was white hot, and the WWE had no choice but to rehire him. And if you're wondering how this glorified stuntman ended up in the UFC, you can pretty much draw a direct line from his Pipe Bomb promo and surging popularity to his signing by the UFC in 2014. While
This is a brief history of B&H, everyone's favorite photo and video store. The year was 1973. The Mets went to the World Series. The first cell phone call was made. And Bleamy and Herman opened a specialty photography shop at 17 Warren Street, New York City. They had a simple philosophy.
Be honest, treat people right, and they will come back.
Thanks, Irving. Also, free candy. And it worked. Over the next 20 years, we expanded and moved to West 17th Street, then 34th Street and 9th Avenue, and added more products. Lighting, binoculars, telescopes, audio, video, tripods, computers, printers, mobile, televisions, projectors, drones, and even more free candy. Now it's 3 stories and over 400,000 products and over 1,000 employees. We take millions of orders online and ship to 179 countries and counting. You can talk to us in person, on the phone,
B&H, how can I help you?
or online. Check out our checkout baskets. Also check out our checkout numbers. Also check out the flare on Marae's vest. And everyone's favorite part, our conveyor belt.
The benefit of the conveyor belt is you don't have to worry about the product or schlep it around anymore until checkout.
Nice. These are the owners. They still come to work every day. They're around here somewhere. Anyway, this is Jeanette. Oh, sorry, she's busy. This is our warehouse. This is Yakov and Levy fighting over lighting kits. B&H is not a chain. B&H is open every day.
While Punk was more popular in the WWE than a steroid that can be applied via baby oil, the company still treated him like he was their very own Dennis Seaver.
Why are we still here? Just to suffer?
Punk was the designated loser whenever The Rock or Brock Lesnar wanted to come out of retirement for a night and get their balls tickled with a win over someone with name brand recognition. The final straw came for Punk at the Royal Rumble in January 2014. He wrestled for 49 minutes, the longest of anyone that night, and was still a designated loser, this time to Dave Bautista, another part-timer taking a break from Hollywood. The audience that night was firmly rooting for either CM Punk or another fan favourite Daniel Bryan to win the Rumble and not this fair-weather wrestler / Hollywood superstar. So when Batista eventually did win, the crowd showered him with more boos than a Brendan Schaub stand-up audience filled with ghosts.
Dicey, dicey!
The Royal Rumble would be the last time Punk ever wrestled for the WWE. On November 26, 2014, he appeared on a podcast with his friend Colt Cabana and aired all of the WWE's dirty jockstraps, from being forced to wrestle while concussed, to being refused treatment for a staph infection because the stitches required would have prevented him from working, to how he had eventually been fired from the WWE on his wedding day, all of which leads us to December 6th, 2014. At UFC 181, Joe Rogan announced to the world that CM Punk was the newest signee for the most prestigious MMA organization on the planet. The announcement could not have been timed worse, choosing UFC 181 as the moment to tell the world you've just signed a guy with more O's on his record than Joe Rogan. Was like choosing Christmas Day to tell your family the dog has to be put down. UFC 181 was one of the best cards of 2014, not to mention one of the only cards the UFC ever put any effort into making a poster for. Robbie Lawler won a 5-round war against Johnny Hendricks to claim the welterweight title, prime Tony Ferguson submitted Abel Trujillo, and Travis Brown punched Brendan Schaub so hard when he woke up he thought he was a stand-up comedian, a debilitating ailment he still suffers from till this day. It was also the same event where Anthony Pettis announced to the world that he was going to be on a fucking Wheaties box. For a sport whose #1 sponsors were Condom Depot and Dude Wipes, it felt like we'd finally made it. Choosing this event to announce to an arena of blood-drunk fans you've just signed a guy who'd never thrown a punch in anger was more tone-deaf than when David Guetta tried to end racism with some sick beats.
So this record is in honor of George Floyd. So shout out to his family. I still have a dream.
But regardless of the timing, the fact remained, CM Punk was now officially in the UFC. Punk's signing is still to this day the single most bizarre signing I can personally think of. Punk was 37 at the time, and aside from taking an occasional jiu-jitsu class with Henner Gracie, had zero actual combat sports experience. But the UFC has never been averse to a good freak show fight, and pre-Endeavour acquisition, they still had one foot firmly in the sideshow-ass roots of MMA. In 2010, former heavyweight champion boxer James Toney talked so much shit about the UFC that Dana gave him a fight against MMA legend Randy Couture.
About trouble. That's why they call me JT, just trouble. Don't get mad at me because God gave me the gift to be a great fighter, period. Randy Couture, I'm gonna get you. I promise you. August 28th, all the stuff you talking, I hope you bring it. I ain't going nowhere. I'm knocking your ass out.
Couture was 42 years old at the time of the fight and still took Toney down with ease and submitted him within 3 minutes of round 1. Brock Lesnar was another pro wrestler who crossed over to the UFC from the WWE. A creature more fist than man, Brock looked like a palette swap of the Cole Train from Gears of War, yet hilariously claimed that he was just an all-natural, juice-free, jacked white boy who we all had to deal with.
I'm a white boy, and I'm jacked. Deal with it.
But despite his fake fighting roots in the WWE, Brock was a decorated collegiate wrestler with ludicrous strength and knockout power. He also had a 1-0 record going into the UFC after winning his first MMA fight in K1. And despite losing his UFC debut, with the help of some whey protein and all-natural supplements, Brock eventually captured the heavyweight title and had 2 successful title defenses.
He is one big bad dude.
Even Dave Batista, the man whose win at WrestleMania was the final straw in Punk leaving the WWE, couldn't just stroll into the UFC when he decided to slide into MMA's DMs. Batista, a man so ludicrously muscular it looks like his max bench press is Brock Lesnar, had his one and only MMA fight in CES MMA against a guy who looked like his idea of a performance-enhancing drug was a McFlurry. CES MMA itself is a promotion so unheard of it may as well be a Steven Seagal dubstep album.
There's an old Zen story of two monks that were walking across the bridge, and the junior monk said to his teacher, he said, what is the Buddha nature?
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. I will snatch every motherfucker birthday. Hey, why don't you guys speak English? I will snatch every motherfucker birthday.
If you're part of a hybrid team, you need to try Lucid. It's a visual collaboration suite, and it helps you quickly align your team no matter where they are. By combining visuals with collaboration, you'll see how to move projects forward. And it doesn't matter what you do. Product development, software engineering, IT, project management, marketing, sales. With Lucid, your team can create a shared vision and be on the same page. Brainstorm visually on an infinite canvas. Identify your team's best ideas. Share, comment, collaborate. Discover opportunities, spot problems, draw conclusions, make decisions, and win over stakeholders to get your work across the finish line. When everyone sees the same thing, they're on the same page. Collaboration is better when it's visual. Try Lucid today.
Sometimes it can feel like there's no way out of treatment-resistant depression. You take one antidepressant after another, and they aren't working for you. It's like you're going in circles. Turn to a different choice. Spravato is the first FDA-approved nasal spray taken with an oral antidepressant for adults with treatment-resistant depression. Spravato works differently. Spravato can cause sleepiness, feeling disconnected from yourself, your thoughts, space and time, dizziness, fainting, spinning sensation, and anxiety. So it's taken under the supervision of a healthcare provider who will monitor you for at least 2 hours after taking Spravato. Don't drive, operate machinery, or perform activities that require full alertness until the next day after a restful sleep. Spravato doesn't prevent suicide, reduce suicidal thoughts or actions, or replace hospitalization if needed. Call your doctor right away about unusual changes in behavior, worsening depression, or thoughts of suicide. Antidepressants may increase suicidal thoughts and actions in people 24 and younger. Spravato is not for use in children. There's a risk for abuse and misuse. Don't take if you have a blood vessel disease, an abnormal connection between your veins and arteries, a history of bleeding in the brain, are pregnant or may become pregnant. Spravato is not for use as a medicine to prevent or relieve pain. Spravato may cause serious side effects such as increased blood pressure, problems thinking clearly, or bladder problems. With fewer depression symptoms, you may be...
To understand why the UFC took a gamble on CM Punk, a guy with an 0-0 record whose fighting style required more choreography than a Broadway musical, you have to cast your mind back to 2014. Back then, the UFC was in a kind of limbo. The Rousey and McGregor era had yet to go full blown. They were both stars, but they weren't unsuspecting victims of the EA curse level of superstardom yet. GSP and Anderson Silva, two of the most bankable pay-per-view draws, were gone, with GSP off hunting aliens and dinosaurs, and Silva trying to put his leg back on after the Weidman fight. Brock Lesnar, the UFC's previous biggest draw, who held the record of 1 million pay-per-view buys for his fight at UFC 100, hadn't fought since a horse meat crazed Overeem kicked the will to live directly out of his body in 2011. In 2014, pay-per-view sales had dropped to their lowest level since 2005. That's pre-season 1 of The Ultimate Fighter levels. Bellator were actually increasing their viewership, and the UFC were inwardly worried. They needed a big name. Someone who could sell pay-per-views. They needed the Mantor.
It looks like a half-man, half-beast.
Just kidding, it was CM Punk. They hired CM Punk. Fan opinion on Punk pre-debut seemed to be evenly split between those who viewed him as a rich asshole playing MMA and taking a spot on the roster from someone who actually deserved it, and those who respected him as a guy pursuing his dream, willing to defy the fact that he was already considered too old for MMA, and essentially skipping the tutorial level and going straight to the end boss in terms of MMA. But one thing almost everyone agreed upon: Punk was going to get monsoned.
You like watching people get fucked for free?
In a year where the UFC had gotten worse ratings than a Steven Seagal black metal album. Don't worry, I'm not gonna do it. Unless you piss me off again. They needed to build up hype around their new signing. They commissioned a 4-part mini-documentary following Punk's journey from zero to slightly more than zero, called The Evolution of Punk. This was pretty big for the UFC, as this was the first documentary of its kind that they had done, and it was airing on actual real television, back when people still watched cable TV. The entire documentary is available on YouTube, and honestly, I'd recommend it. Punk generally comes across as a likeable and humble person, and is more than willing to accept that what he's doing isn't so much bordering on crazy as it is several hundred miles past that border, conducting a full-scale one-man invasion with his pants around his ankles. But while the UFC were making documentaries about Punk and desperately trying to generate hype for the MMA equivalent of watching a man step on a rake, there was one part of the equation they had so far neglected to factor in. Punk had a fight contract, but still had no opponent. While Dana looked for an opponent by rummaging behind the UFC sofa and called Dennis Seaver to ask if he knew anyone worse at MMA than him, Punk was quite literally being called out by random forum posters and weirdos on Twitter.
You might remember me from Twitter blowing you up all the time, asking you for a fight. My question to you is...
You might remember me from Twitter is the greatest Troy McClure that The Simpsons never ever used.
Are you finished?
This may have been the only fight in UFC history where Keyboard Warrior was a fighting style that actually stood a chance against a UFC fighter. After an exhaustive search of every gutter and ditch across the USA for an opponent CM Punk could possibly beat, Dana found his guy while filming a reality TV show, Dana White's Looking for Cocaine. Dana White's looking for a fight. After winning his pro debut, a fighter named Mickey Gall took to the mic, and knowing Dana was in attendance, chose to drink from the poison chalice and called out CM Punk.
Has an opponent? Oh, I'd love to fight that man, CM Punk.
In a rather bizarre move, instead of immediately making the fight between Punk and Mickey Gall, Dana gave Gall a warm-up fight in the UFC, allowing him to gain more fight experience while CM Punk was still working to get his first stripe on his white belt. To make matters worse, in August of 2015, Punk suffered a shoulder injury which scrapped his chances of fighting anytime soon. While he was recovering, Gall was gaining more octagon experience. Gall's first opponent in the UFC was a man charitably described as the worst fighter ever to set foot in the octagon whose name isn't CM Punk. That man was Mike Jackson. Mike Jackson is a part-time mixed martial artist who competes sporadically in the UFC, choosing to make his money elsewhere as a photographer and videographer for a smaller fight promotion called LFA. Which is probably a wise decision on his part, as Mike Jackson is to MMA what Wingdings is to fonts. If Jackson was a Star Wars movie, he'd be Star Odyssey.
Poor deluded fools.
What do you think we should do now, Commander? I suggest we return to the station.
Quick, we haven't got a second to lose.
Damn you, Norman. Norman, you interfering, warm-blooded animal. Who authorized you to reactivate me? Why can't two poor robots commit suicide in peace?
actually, scratch that. This movie is incredible and more entertaining than Jackson's entire career.
I'm very confident I can defeat Mickey Gall and have a successful career in the UFC.
Oh, beautiful.
Gall Gall made short work of Jackson, submitting him within a minute, and post-fight, he and Punk came face-to-face for the first time. Their fight was initially scheduled for UFC 200, but UFC 200 took place on top of multiple Native American burial grounds and was cursed while still in the womb. The headliner was supposed to be a rematch between Nate Diaz and Conor McGregor, but McGregor employed his Sun Tzu-level generalship and played chicken with the UFC, assuming he was a big enough star that he could avoid doing all the media obligations and still get to be in the main event. He was wrong, and the UFC pulled the fight. Jones vs Cormier 2 was moved up to the main event, but John Jones decided to ingest a fully loaded container ship's worth of PEDs, and that fight was scrapped too, leaving Cormier to fight what appeared to be Anderson Silva's overweight cousin. Had Punk v Gall made it onto UFC 200, it would have been the first card in history to feature two former WWE superstars, as Brock Lesnar, he of the phallic chest tattoo and 500 kilos of all-natural muscle, made a surprise return for UFC 200. Lesnar defeated Mark Hunt, and then immediately pissed so hot he may as well have had a bladder full of xenomorph blood. This led to years of Mark Hunt filing lawsuits against the UFC, alleging that the reason they granted Brock a drug testing exemption for UFC 200 was because they knew full well he was pissing molten lava, but couldn't risk losing another high-profile fight.
I'm gonna get you, motherfucker. I'm gonna get your bitch ass.
But to further cement the fact that UFC 200 was suffering from more curses than a gypsy with Tourette's, Punk had been keeping secret the fact that 3 days after his stare down with Mickey Gall, he was due to get back surgery for a herniated disc. The fight was never going to make UFC 200, and yet again, Punk's debut was delayed. At this point, most of the opinions from fighters and fans was that this whole experiment was essentially an MMA Hindenburg and that Punk was never going to set foot in the octagon. Those people were wrong, but I swear to Dana, I wish they'd been right. After successfully recovering from back surgery, Punk vs Gall was finally confirmed for September 10th, 2016 at UFC 203. Watching the Fight Week footage from 203 nowadays, it's hard to not feel a little bit like Punk was at a UFC LARPing session. He did interviews and open workouts, weigh-ins and Q&A sessions, all the standard Fight Week obligations, yet here was a man being interviewed by Ariel Helwani, who had the same amount of combat experience as Ariel himself. Punk's Fight Week was uncharted territory for combat sports. No 0-0 fighter had ever debuted on such a grand stage. Normally people with records less noteworthy than MC Hammer's The Funky Headhunter are ground up into a fine paste and spat out by shows like Contender Series or Tough. No other sport on this planet would entertain the notion of debuting someone with zero experience at the highest level. Hell, even boxing promoters would think twice about this, and when those guys have the moral high ground, you know you're beyond fucked. It was a bizarre situation to witness, but Punk paid no attention to the social media shitstorm surrounding this fight, or the fighters giving him a shoulder so cold it was practically dipped in liquid nitrogen. This was his dream being made a reality. He had finally made it. It's Fight Week, and for better or worse, he was a real UFC fighter about to have a real fight. But there was no LARPing in the octagon. The fight was perfectly summed up by Joe Rogan during Punk's walkout. This fight was more confusing than Tito Ortiz's parenting methods.
Now it's about my kids. I want to live. I want to outlive my children. Of course, 100%.
This was the first time since James Toney that Bruce Buffer had to introduce an 0-0 fighter on the main card of a pay-per-view. This was the first time a fighter's sizzle reel had no fight footage and had to rely on training montages to hype fans up. This was the first time a man with an 0-0 record would be paid $500,000 for a fight, while his opponent made 30 grand. Nothing about any of this made sense. But the octagon can make sense of the senseless. It is the great equalizer. All the bluff and bluster, the hype and the hubris cannot hide when the lights of a packed arena are shone upon them. And here, we would finally get to see what happens when a 37-year-old with no prior experience sets foot in the octagon. And that was it. In case you missed it, I'm talking about that winging, wild right hand from Punk. That was all he got to show for 2 years training at one of the most accomplished gyms in MMA. That was the culmination of a dream for Punk. It was the sum total of hundreds of hours of training, all his injuries, all the surgeries, all the grueling hours spent in the gym away from his wife and friends. That one shot was Punk's attempt to defy his critics. A flailing, overhand right to silence all the people who said he was using then Tito Ortiz parenting methods. $1 million for a fight while his opponent made 30 grand. Nothing about any of this made sense. But the Octagon can make sense of the senseless. It is the great equalizer. All the bluff and bluster, the hype and the hubris cannot hide when the lights of a packed arena are shone upon them. And here, we would finally get to see what happens when a 37-year-old with no prior experience sets foot in the Octagon.
Here we go!
Finally get to see what happens when a 37-year-old with no prior experience sets foot in the Octagon.
Here we go!
And that was it. In case you missed it, I'm talking about that winging, wild right hand from Punk. That was all he got to show for 2 years training at one of the most accomplished gyms in MMA. That was the culmination of a dream for Punk. It was the sum total of hundreds of hours of training, all his injuries, all the surgeries, all the grueling hours spent in the gym away from his wife and friends. That one shot was Punk's attempt to defy his critics. A flailing, overhand right to silence all the people who said he was too old, too unathletic, that he was a fake fighter. With that fist, Punk could slay his critics, obliterate Mickey Gall, and even kill a god. But that right hand missed by a distance so great, it's visible on Google Maps. That was the single offensive strike Punk threw in the entire fight. Mickey Gall ducked under it, double-legged, and choked him out. After 2 years of work, all the hype, the hate, the Punk experiment came to the conclusion that everyone not named CM Punk had predicted.
There's probably an alternate reality where I win and I'm still disappointed in myself. That's just who I am. You know, I'm just really, really hard on myself. I lost, and it sucks, and it was lopsided, and it's upsetting. But I know I'm better than that.
On to your left. I'm curious. Your wife was, very, cautious about, watching you train, being here tonight. What did you say to her? What did she say to you after the fight?
Oh, you guys are all gonna make me cry. She just said she was proud of me.
So, shout out to his family.
Hybrid work is better with Lucid, the visual collaboration suite.
Do you feel puzzled why trades often turn against